Now, knowing this information is absolutely crucial before you start purchasing parts for your PC build. Now, when you're a creator and you're building your PC or upgrading a PC, there's a few different parts that give you performance. There's GPU, there's RAM, there's CPU. How do you know in your workflow which of these parts is actually gonna give you performance? Because you can have a workflow where an upgraded part doesn't give you any performance, and you can be in a workflow where you have the max parts, but something else in your system is causing a bottleneck, making the other parts perform actually slower, or having the higher end parts in a CPU or RAM, for example, doesn't matter because you've got a CPU bottleneck or a RAM bottleneck or a GPU bottleneck or bottleneck somewhere else. We're going to go through the different creator workflows and figuring out which of these parts is the most important and which can cause bottlenecks in your workflow. Amazon Music Unlimited. I'll give you the best news from the get-go. If you sign up for the Amazon Music free trial through the links in the description below, you don't just get 1 month free trial, not 2, not 3, but 4-month free trial of Amazon Music. This is limited time only, so act fast through the links in the description below. So Amazon Music has over 100 million songs and podcasts, so whatever you're looking for, they've got it. Listen anywhere, offline and online, ad-free. Now you can also use your Alexa devices to voice command ask Alexa to play any song or podcast you want. We find it especially convenient when cooking in the kitchen. So sign up for the free trial right now through the links below and get 4 months for free. Limited time only, so act fast. Firstly, bottleneck. What is a bottleneck? Bottleneck means that you have something in your system that causes the other parts wait for that part. So what I mean is, if you've got a CPU bottleneck, it means that your CPU is slow enough to cause a bottleneck for your GPU and RAM, for example, so that your GPU and RAM are waiting for the CPU to finish doing its thing, whatever tasks it's doing, before they can kind of help with some of the other workloads. Or perhaps your GPU and CPU are waiting for the RAM to get emptied so they can fill the capacity again because there's not enough RAM capacity. Or for example, your RAM and CPU are waiting for your GPU to finish encoding or rendering before they can start moving on to some other things. So that's a bottleneck essentially. And if you don't know how to figure out a bottleneck in your system, it's very, very simple. I highly recommend downloading Hardware Info 64. It's a free software that monitors your hardware inside your PC. Just open it, click sensors only, and then let it run in the background of your just normal working day. In the end of the day, you can just see what is your maximum capacity that RAM was allocated, for example. You can see temperatures of all of the parts. Perhaps you're temperature bottlenecked. Perhaps you were VRAM capacity bottleneck. Maybe your GPU was utilized maximum and that was the bottleneck, or was it the CPU? You can see that all in there and then perhaps figure out, should I be, adding more RAM? Should I be upgrading the GPU, CPU, and so on? It makes it easier to detect the bottleneck in your system. But let's go through the 3 main creator workflows. First of all, photography, then video, and then 3D. So photo editing and photographers, what are the most important parts for your system, for your creator PC? Because you can really waste your money buying the wrong part for your system. Firstly, I would say that the most important thing for creators is the CPU. If you're building a photo editing PC, then the CPU is the single-handed most important thing, what you're going to be using. And most likely you're going to notice or experience a CPU bottleneck the first, because most of the things are reliant on this one. Now, most of the time on photo editing, you won't be using multi-core performance. You'll be using single-core performance, which means you're tweaking some of the faders or adjusting the, color grade of the photo, or you're building some kind of text around the Photoshop, or selecting things, or just working. It's called single-core performance, where you simply just adjusting the photo, let's say it in that way. You're adjusting or tuning the photo. That's single core performance, and having a faster cores is very, very important. So going with a Ryzen 7600X, for example, which is only a 6-core CPU but has very good single core performance, is much more beneficial than going and buying this big slab of a Xeon CPU that costs thousands of dollars and doesn't actually give you any performance increase. But that is not all to do with photo editing. You also have multi-core performance, and photographers and photo editing can utilize multi-core performance. And when that happens is when you're exporting, let's say, a big batch of photos to a different format. For example, let's say you've done your editing and now it's time to export those raw files to JPEG, TIFFs or PNGs or whatever format you're using. You're exporting then suddenly all of those CPU cores boost up and every one of these is chewing through that. So depending on your workflow, if you do a lot of that, perhaps having a more core CPU or a better multi-core performance CPU is a better choice for you. In Lightroom Classic, that's very nicely seen in the Puget Benz Lightroom benchmark, where you have active and passive score, where passive score is, really exporting or merging photos or doing something like that, like putting a panorama together. That's where you use the multi-core performance. I'd say most of the people will probably cap out at the Ryzen 9s or i9 CPUs from Intel, and it's not beneficial to go with the Xeons or the Threadripper platform CPUs. But there are certain cases and certain workflows where perhaps you are editing or you are literally batch exporting thousands and thousands of photos, and then you might actually want to upgrade to a Xeon or Threadripper platform where the multi-core performance is absolutely insane. Now, the second most important thing in photography workflow is the RAM. And the more and faster you have the RAM, the better. This XPG Lancer blade this is only 16 gigabytes over here, but you might be fooled by thinking this is 6,000 megatransfers per second, which is quite fast compared to DDR4, and the latency is pretty good as well. We've got a CL30 latency, which is very, very fast, RAM. But as a photographer, the fast RAM might not be the most important thing for you if you are capacity bottlenecked, which means that if your program, let's say using Lightroom Classic and Photoshop, I can easily see over 40 gigabytes used when I'm editing thumbnails or photos, which means that if you are professional photographer, photo editor, most likely 16 gigabytes is not enough for you. 32 gigabytes is probably not enough for you as well. And I'd say the sweet spot is at 64 gigabytes. So if you can upgrade your RAM to 64 gigabytes as well, if you don't have it already. Now, I'd recommend sticking to 2 sticks from the get-go. So don't get 4 sticks, because then later on you can upgrade it to 128 gigabytes if necessary. And the third most important thing for your photo editing PC is the GPU. And I'd say this is the least important thing in your system, because if you are looking at some of the benchmarks I have set on the channel, then you can see that 4090, like I have over here, or a 4070, there isn't that much of a difference. And in fact, sometimes the 4070 performs better. And I've tested the 3050, and sometimes the 3050 performs better than the 4090 because of the clock speeds of the GPU. So it's not necessarily the more money you pay for your GPU actually gives you more performance in photo editing, because there's only very limited tasks and features in the software that can utilize the GPU. We're seeing more and more of these roll out, like an AI denoiser in Lightroom Classic, or some of the AI features in Photoshop, or Topaz AI is also using GPU. But for most people, still having a very powerful GPU really doesn't give any more performance. So I'd say leave the last budget for your photo editing PC on the GPU department and spend most of it on CPU and RAM. Next of all, video editors, and which is the most important thing for video editing. And a lot of people might say it's the GPU, but actually I think it is the CPU, and here's why. If I've got a very fast GPU and a very slow CPU, I'm still not gonna get as good of a performance if I have a low-end GPU and a high-end CPU. So to me, the most important thing for your video editing is the CPU, because that's what you're using most of the time. You're gonna be doing little adjustments in there. You're not exporting the video all the time VRAM, but you are using decoding of the video all the time because you're looking through and playing back video, making cuts, adjusting, making color grade adjustments, that the faster the CPU, the better it is. And also don't forget the quick sync feature from Intel CPUs that have iGPU. So if you're buying a CPU, most likely Intel CPU for video editing because they are right now better for most people. Don't buy an F variant. I've preached about this on the channel so much, but don't make that mistake because that actually unlocks performance that no other part can give you. Even a 4090 or a $10,000 RTX A6000 Ada is not going to give you either, because certain codecs are only supported hardware playback on the iGPU on that CPU. So overall, spending more on the CPU is going to be the most beneficial for videographers. But then the second bit is actually the GPU. And before we reach the RAM, the second thing is the GPU, because depending on your workflow, this is very, very important as well. More and more we're seeing the GPU accelerating the video editing performance, whether it's color grading, GPU effects, or encoding or decoding. The GPU can take a lot of the workflow and also help you with the VRAM capacity. Now, depending on your resolution and the complex of your editing timeline and workflow, you might be VRAM bottlenecked. So on the previous 30 series GPUs, to get 12 gigabytes of VRAM, we had to get very much the top end GPUs like 3080, 12 gigabytes, the one that was released later, and 3080 Ti and 3090 were the ones that had more VRAM. But now we can have a 12 gigabytes even on a 4070, which some people might argue is still little and we need more in 2023. And I partly agree with you, but I still think this is a right step forward to having more RAM on a lower end GPUs. So this Zotac RTX 4070 here has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which is very, very nice. And in my experience, when we're editing these videos on the channel, as you can see, there's 1, 2, and 3 cameras, one up there as well. And when we're editing the timeline of this, we often saw about 18 point something gigabytes of VRAM used. And for that reason, we needed to upgrade to RTX 4090 just not to be bottlenecked by VRAM, because we would fill the VRAM and then the whole editing workflow would just kind of be stuttering and the timeline's not as smooth, as fluid. So we were only able to find that out because we were running the hardware monitor in the background. So have a look. If you're maxing 90% or more of your VRAM, most likely your VRAM bottlenecked and you might need a better higher end GPU for that. And then the third most important thing for a video editing PC is the RAM. Having more RAM is absolutely crucial, and if you think just 16 gigabytes is enough, it's definitely not enough. Have a look at the same model and see if they do more or higher capacities. And don't get 2 of these either, because having 4 sticks and getting 32 gigabytes really isn't a good option, because first of all, you're not going to have any future upgradability without throwing the old sticks away and buying new sticks. You might struggle to run them at the maximum speed of, the XMP speed, which these ones are 6000 for example. But now we have actually larger capacity RAM as well. So you can get 32 gigabyte sticks, which is quite standard, and you know about this already. And Team Group, T-Create, Expert here, they have beautiful RAM sticks. I can't wait to build something with this. If you know what's coming, let me know in the comment section below. We're gonna build something absolutely epic with this. But I have 128 gigabytes in here. There's 2 64 gigabyte kits and you can get 128 gigabytes. But now we also have 96 gigabyte RAM kits, which means that you can get 96 gigabytes with just 2 channels, which means they are more likely to reach the RAM speed and megahertz that's advertised in XMP without actually, ticking over your IMC and actually resulting crashes on your Windows because your IMC can't keep up with it, which is good. The sweet spot again for video editors, I'd say, is 64 gigabytes. I can easily see that filled when working with Adobe products. But if you're working with Resolve, then perhaps the RAM isn't as important, because I can see that Resolve likes to use more VRAM rather than RAM, and Premiere Pro likes to use more RAM as well as VRAM. So Resolve is a little bit more efficient and not as taxing on the RAM capacity, but still 64 gigabytes I'd say is a good sweet spot that you can later upgrade to 128 gigabytes if needed. The absolute minimum capacity I would recommend for 4K editing in 2024 is 32 gigabytes. So try not to go below that if possible. I am easily seeing over 80 and 90 gigabytes sometimes used when editing these videos. And lastly, 3D. And as you can see, all of these different workflow PCs are very different. You can't just get all the best parts and then that's necessarily good for you, because it doesn't work like that. Now for 3D, the most important thing, I would say number one thing, is the GPU. And having a good GPU like the 4090 or even a 4070 is absolutely crucial, especially if you're rendering in 3D, because Nvidia is absolutely killing it with rendering performance. The CUDA and optics for the 4070 and 4090 especially, the 4090 is absolutely insane killer of a GPU. And if you're a 3D creator and if you have the budget, like spending more on Nvidia GPUs really goes up very nicely. The GPUs scale very linearly, really. The more you pay, the more you're gonna get. I would say that going below 4070 really isn't good there, because we're gonna start to get into some of the memory bus issues and bottlenecks. So have a look at my 4060 Ti really there. But I'd say the 4070 is one of those like on the borderline where I think the memory bus is a little bit of an issue, but not that much still, that I can recommend this. We get 12 gigabytes of VRAM and just insane rendering performance. There's no match from AMD or even Intel for this, which is crazy. Like the best of AMD, the 7900 XTX can really keep up with just the 4070 in terms of rendering performance. And the Nvidia software support is second to none. We're talking about Octane Render, V-Ray, Redshift, anything you want there, it will work with Nvidia cards. Where going with AMD or Intel cards, you might start to get into some issues, but they're still improving and getting better and performing and giving more competition for Nvidia in 3D rendering, which I'm very happy about. But number one thing in 3D is definitely GPU for you, because most of the rendering gets done on the GPU rather than CPU, or at least that's where the industry is going towards. The second most important thing is the CPU, because when you're not rendering on the GPU, or rendering a scene or putting the image together, you're actually working on the modeling or the 3D scene, and for that you're actually using the CPU and the single core performance of the CPU. You're just moving things around, adjusting things, making the models. That's where the CPU is actually coming in, and having a fast single core performance CPU is very important. And perhaps sometimes, depending on your workflow, can be more important than actually the rendering. But rendering you still need to see what you have created, or rendering the light and rendering the shades and everything, which the GPU will take over. By the way, if you haven't switched over your software to render on GPU than CPU, then please do that. I had a very good friend in 3D rendering who was working on some of the animations, and I said, "You're rendering on your GPU, right?" Because we were out on a meal, and he said, "Well, my PC takes forever to render these things." And I was like, "You've got a very good GPU. Why didn't you sweat that over?" And he said, "I'm not sure." He texted me the next day, said, "Thanks, I switched it over and now my rendering is 4 times faster because I'm rendering on GPU rather than CPU." But not always you can render on a GPU. For example, if your scenes or projects get so large that you can't load those assets on the VRAM, and you are maxing out on the VRAM capacity, whether it's 12 or 24 gigabytes, lean to the CPU rendering. And if you need that for your workflow, and you know who you are. But some of the very high-end 3D productions run Threadripper and Cyan systems, most likely Threadripper, because Cyan still isn't really a good match for AMD Threadripper there, because they need a lot of RAM. And if you remember Damien, we did the PC for Damien. Damien needed a lot of RAM to render a lot of the things and just use a lot of RAM for his 3D modeling. And that's why you might need a higher end CPU that supports more than 128 gigabytes or 64 gigabytes, what you see on a mainstream platform. But the good news is that because of these 96 gigabyte memory modules, we can get up to 192 gigabytes RAM from just the normal Intel or AMD system that supports DDR5. You might need a BIOS update for that, but it is supported. If you need above that, AMD Threadripper or Xeon is the way to go. The last quick mention about CPU in 3D rendering is that the iGPU, I don't see any performance from the iGPU, so perhaps skipping the iGPU for 3D rendering really doesn't give you any performance loss, so you're not going to gain any. For video editing, that's important. And we covered the RAM already. Depending on your workflow, I'd say 64 gigabytes is the nice sweet spot. If scenes get larger and you need more, obviously opt for more. And then you might actually, whether you need to actually start with a Xeon or Threadripper platform, or is just the mainstream PC just okay for you. For example, architects, you might not necessarily need a Threadripper CPU, depending what you're doing, but a mainstream CPU is very, very good with just a good GPU will be a good benefit for you. Now, if you're wondering which one of these parts, whether AMD or Intel or NVIDIA, CPUs, GPUs, RAM is best for your workflow, then check out the individual reviews. If you want to see i9 13900K or 1490, I've got reviews on my channel for creators, so you can check out your workflow in your performance, if this is actually any good, and you can compare whether to go AMD, NVIDIA, Intel, check this out. But knowing the different parts and how these affect your workflow as a creator is very, very important before building the PC or before deciding how to spend your budget on which part in your PC build. Talking about PC building, if you don't know which PC to build, I've got build guides in the description below, and I'm going to give you the best bang for buck for any of the budget. You can see there's 4 different budgets, and I'm talking about all the upgrades and downgrades in there. So pick the one that's closest to your budget, and I'll explain everything else in there. You'll find out which are the best parts to buy for your budget, but then bear in mind as well which workflow you're going for, because for your workflow, you might want to spend more on the CPU or on the GPU. If you enjoyed this video, why don't you hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the brand new merch down in the description below. You'll find the link there. There's a little tick over there. You'll find the merch. There's cool things out there, and if you've got any requests, I'd love to know from you. I'll meet you in the comments below. Bye bye.